Today is Monday, January 12th. I threw this presentation invitation out late last night when I got the news headline that the Fed had been subpoenaed and threatened with indictment, and that makes me really worried about interest rate news. And interest rates are not the sexiest thing, but I'm telling you they are extremely important, and so that's why I wanted to get this information out to you guys right away. So let's jump into it here. Okay. So, the economic story of 2026 will be two things: US interest rates and imperialism. Okay. Now, if the word imperialism scares you or strikes you as having some negative connotation or something, let me dissuade that by sharing the definition with you, which is imperialism is simply a policy or ideology extending a country's power and influence through diplomacy, economic dominance, or military force. Okay. And I don't care what side of the political spectrum of you're on. If you have voted for either a Democrat or a Republican during your lifetime, you have voted in favor of imperialism. Okay. If you voted for a libertarian, you're off the hook. Okay. Everybody else absolutely favors imperialism. It's just what taste you have for those three methods of exerting imperialism. All right. It doesn't mean we're not a democracy. It doesn't mean we're not a capitalist system. Okay. But we absolutely all buy into the idea of imperialism. Okay. And so what am I talking about when I say imperialism and interest rate news? Well, I'm talking about these news headlines. Okay. Interest rate news headlines and imperialism news headlines, right? On the imperialism side, I'll just start there and get it out of the way. Obviously kidnapping Maduro from Venezuela, now saying that we're going to run the country. That is a form of imperialism, right? It is a little more overt imperialism than we are typically used to, but that is absolutely a form of imperialism. Also talking about acquiring Greenland, taking control of Cuba or Colombia, right? Those are all just recent news headlines about not really a change in U.S. policy, but a change in our approach to practicing imperialism around the world, right? I fully expect that those news headlines will continue and they will have an economic impact. But frankly, the economic impact of that is not what I'm focusing on for today's presentation. Interest rates. That is what I'm focusing on for today's presentation. Okay, so big headlines. Last week, we heard President Trump announce that he's going to ask Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac to purchase $200 billion of mortgage-backed securities. What that is it's quantitative easing. Okay, and I'm going to get into more about quantitative easing later, but quantitative easing, it's just a way of pushing more money into the system to try and stimulate the economy. Okay, we had quantitative easing after the Great Recession in 2008. We had quantitative easing in COVID. Typically, it's reserved for like economic catastrophes, but this is a signal that we may be moving into a phase of new quantitative easing, right? Also, Sunday's news, right? Sunday's headline yesterday: the Fed received a subpoena and a threat of criminal indictment. It is kind of on its face. It's about a building remodel, but it has nothing to do with a building remodel. This is all about influencing Fed interest rate policy. And if you don't believe me, hopefully you believe all four living Fed chairmen who all came out and said, yeah, this is about controlling interest rate policy. Okay. Two Supreme Court cases that are going to be big in the news this year. Okay. Trump versus Cook. This is Lisa Cook. She's a sitting Fed governor. Trump wants to fire her, and the Supreme Court is hearing whether he's allowed to do that. Also, very much related, Trump versus Slaughter. Slaughter was the FTC chairman. Trump fired her. And again, the Supreme Court is deciding whether he's allowed to do that. How the Supreme Court rules in both of those cases, I think, has huge ramifications for the amount of political control over interest rate policy we're likely to see going forward. Okay. And then finally, Fed Chairman Powell, his term is up in May. President Trump will appoint a new Fed chair. And so who he appoints and how they decide to run their business and how beholden they are to President Trump. Again, huge impact on interest rate policy and economics and your portfolio. Okay, so let's continue getting into it. All right. So lower interest rates. There's nothing wrong with low interest rates. Matter of fact, None of us disagree that interest rates should be dropped. Okay. The issue is who controls interest rate policy and how quick those rates go down and how long they stay down. Okay. The act of lowering interest rates is an economic stimulus. Okay. What it does is it stimulates growth by lowering borrower costs for both consumers and businesses. Okay, it encourages businesses to invest and expand their businesses, hire employees, right? These are all good things. Okay, kind of a gray area good thing is it encourages more spending instead of savings. Because if you're only getting 1% or less on your savings account, maybe you just decide to spend that money, right? Consumer spending is a huge part of economic growth in this country. Okay. Now, the other kind of gray area one is it tends to reduce the value of the US dollar. Now, that is very much in line with President Trump's desire to encourage our export industry here in the US, right? He wants to export more goods. Well, it's a whole lot easier to export goods if those goods are cheaper to the people buying them, which are other countries. So the lower the value of the dollar, the more that encourages exports. On the flip side, right, the economic harm that lower interest rates can have is one, leads to inflation. Every single time, without a doubt, you can draw a straight line between interest rates being too low for too long and inflation. And if you don't believe me, I'm going to prove it to you as we go through this. Finally, or in addition to, imported products are going to be more expensive. Okay. If you're on the buying side of this equation and you're not an exporter of goods, you're a buyer of goods, every shirt you get from China is going to cost you more money because the US dollar is worth less because of low interest rates, right? Bonds and savings accounts are going to pay less. And then typically we see debt levels rise, both government debt levels, but also just individual consumer and business debt levels, right? So those are all kind of the impact of lower interest rates. Okay, so interest rate policy. Again, nobody is saying interest rates shouldn't go lower, right? There's some disagreement within the Fed about when we should lower them and how much we should lower them, but everybody agrees it's right about time for interest rates to start coming down, okay? We kind of managed to whip the high inflation of a few years ago. Inflation is reasonably under control, and we're also starting to have a little bit of economic slowdown, okay? The economy is growing slower than it was. That is typically the sign that maybe we're reaching a mature area of the expansion. Okay. During that period where we kind of reach that mature part of the expansion, it's very normal for interest rates to begin lowering. What that will do is it'll give the expansion a few more years and hopefully make the eventual decline, because there's always going to be a decline, right? It makes the eventual decline a little more tolerable. Okay, so during the expansion, interest rates rise in the beginning, then towards the end of the expansion, interest rates fall, and then as the economy increases again, right, interest rates increase, and so we're kind of at this point, sort of like up over here, right, where where it would be normal for interest rates to begin going down again. Okay, so again, this is not about interest rate policy. This is about control over interest rates. Okay, and by far the best economic impacts come when there is an independent body controlling interest rates. Unfortunately, there are staggering number of examples of the bad consequences that come when political bodies control interest rates. And that's what I'm going to kind of go through. Okay. And again, I want to stress this is not about Republican or Democrat. Okay. Just because you have a Republican in the White House right now and he's the one trying to take control of interest rates, eventually the shoe's going to be on the other foot. Okay. And if we decide the president gets to decide interest rates, eventually the party you don't like is going to be in the White House and they're going to be the ones deciding interest rates. In either case, it's bad economically. Okay. And we've seen this before. Let me take you through some US examples. Okay, let's go back to the 1960s. Lyndon B. Johnson, Democrat, okay? He's waging a war in Vietnam and at the same time trying to create the Great Society, right? His social programs, okay? Very expensive. So what does he do? He tries to influence through jawboning, getting on the phone, kind of, twisting the arm of the Fed chair. At that time, his name was William Martin, to try and keep interest rates low. He was successful. He convinced through jawboning, through kind of, political pressure, he managed to convince William Martin to keep interest rates low so that he can continue funding the war at a lower cost and his social programs at a lower borrowing cost. Okay. That policy continued with the next president, a Republican, Richard Nixon. Okay. Richard Nixon, he wanted to get reelected. Okay. And he saw the economy beginning to slow going into the reelection of 1972. Okay. So Richard Nixon got on the phone with the Fed chair and said, hey, I'm going to exert political pressure on you. We actually know what he said. You can actually listen to the tapes, but he exerted political pressure on Chairman Arthur Burns. He made promises and kept interest rates low to try and spur on the economy to get his landslide reelection in 1972. Of course, he did end up resigning the presidency in 1974. Okay, so keep in mind, low interest rates, too low for too long through the 60s and through the 70s. And what was the consequence? Well, Carter came into office, right? And when Carter came into office, he kept it going pretty much. He wasn't so much meddling with the Federal Reserve at that point, but he did decide, like a lot of Democratic presidents do, that he was going to pass a big stimulus package. Okay, so here you have monetary policy on one side, that's the interest rate policy that the Fed decides, and then you have fiscal policy on the other side. That's what Congress and the president do to spend money. So Carter talks to Congress, gets this $200 billion stimulus package passed, and that just continues the upward pressure on inflation. Okay. Inflation went insane until finally in 1979, Carter appointed this guy, Paul Volcker, who I love that picture of him because he looks like Winston Churchill with the cigar smoke in his mouth, right? He appoints Paul Volcker in 1979. Paul Volcker takes interest rates from 10% to 18% in order to whip the inflation of the 70s. Was that because of what Carter did? Sort of, but it mostly had to do with what Lyndon Johnson and President Nixon did, right? But it wasn't until Carter, right, a decade later, that we had to suffer the consequences of low interest rates too much for too long as a result of presidents inflicting political pressure and a Fed not being able to maintain its independence. All right. So, where did the inflation that we had today come from, right? Was it President Biden's fault because we had, 9% inflation in the first few years of his presidency? Of course not. It goes all the way back to 2008. Okay, 2008, Great Recession. The whole global economy crashes. And what happens? The Fed lowers interest rates to zero. They enact quantitative easing, right? There's that word coming back in again, quantitative easing, and they just pump tons of money into the economy. And they keep interest rates low for basically a decade, okay? Until about 2016, when the Fed begins to slowly increase interest rates, okay? They know they've kept interest rates very low for very long, and they're trying to get ahead of the future inflation problem they know is going to come. Okay, so in 2016, 2017, and 2018, they start to slowly increase interest rates, trying to get ahead of the problem. But then what happens? The economy begins slowing. Okay, so in 2019, they start decreasing interest rates slowly because they're worried about we're going into a new economic cycle. And then what happens? The COVID crash. Okay, COVID hits like a bomb in 2020. All of a sudden, we're in an economic crisis. And the Fed decides, again, lower interest rates to zero and not double down, but triple down on quantitative easing, pumping $10 trillion into the economy basically overnight. Okay. And it was the aggregate sum of all of these actions, interest rates too low for too long, too much quantitative easing, that then finally led to the inflation that we had in 2021, 2022, and 2023. That caused the Fed in 2022 to increase interest rates farther and faster than they ever had in history. and that ground a lot of economic activity to a halt. But kind of amazingly, we did not go through a recession. We did not experience negative economic growth despite that. We more or less managed to get inflation under control. You can pretty much say it kind of worked. It actually worked pretty darn well. Okay, so what is my nightmare scenario, right? I've given you some examples of in the US, some times where we've had a little bit of political influence over the Fed and it turned out really bad. I've showed you how, low interest rates for too long resulted in inflation just a few years ago, right? So hopefully we're all on the same page about the impact of interest rates on inflation. Okay. None of those are really my nightmare scenario because we can handle that. Okay, so let me show you my nightmare scenario. Okay, Turkey. Turkey in the year 2000 recovers from a huge financial crisis. They start to get their act together and they finally make their central bank politically independent. Okay, they put these structures in place so that their central bank can be independent. Okay, for the next 15 years, Turkey has really pretty good financial success, growing economy. They keep inflation relatively low. They keep unemployment relatively low. It's going pretty darn well for an emerging economy. Okay. Until President Erdogan takes over. Okay. And in 2018, he's kind of a strong man. He completely dismantles Fed independence. Of course, they call it the central bank, right? But same thing. He dismantles all the protections and he puts in place his ability to just simply name the Fed governor or the central bank governor in this case and decide interest rate policy himself. The economy immediately crashes. Interest rates go through the roof. Inflation goes through the roof. It's a complete nightmare. He destroys the economy until finally in 2024, they managed to wrestle back independence for the finance minister, who has now dramatically raised interest rates and been successful in bringing inflation down from the high 80s down to the 30s. And that's what they're calling success at this point. Okay. So Turkey, very good example of the nightmare scenario where a president just simply takes over control of interest rates and screws the whole thing up. Okay. What's another good example? Zimbabwe in the 2000s. Okay. Zimbabwe, again, president takes control, political control over interest rates, manages to get inflation all the way up to 80 billion percent. I don't even know what that looks like. Okay. But inflation in Zimbabwe went to 80 billion percent. It made the currency completely worthless. They ended up having to completely abandon their currency and take over the US dollar as their currency. Argentina in the 1990s, same type of thing. Political political leader takes over control of interest rates. Inflation goes to 3,000% annually, destroys the economy, destroys the value of the currency, right? Soviet Union in the 80s and early 90s to compete, right, with the spending war, with the arms race with the US. The political party, right, reduces interest rates, tries to keep it low, tries to push social programs to stave off civil unrest, right? That ends up destroying the currency and the country ends up collapsing both politically and economically. And then finally, kind of the classic example is Germany post World War I. They owe all these reparations to all these countries. They can't pay the debts. So what do? They just lower interest rates, increase the money supply to kind of make the real value of those debts go away. It destroys the economy and ushers in the Nazi party, and we all know where that ended up. Okay. So this is pretty much every non-wartime example of a political party, a political leader taking control of interest rates. There are like zero non-wartime examples of political leaders taking control of interest rates and it going well. Okay. Really, the only example we can kind of sort of point to is Japan after we bombed the you know what out of it. Sure, they had to rebuild from scratch, and so they took political control over interest rates. Also, during World War II, the US artificially kept interest rates low in order to fund the war effort. But again, it's only really worked during wartime. Okay. When more or less the country was kind of united under this like singular goal. It never works in non-wartime because it becomes a political tennis match. Okay. All right. So let's keep going. So when does this nightmare, hypothetical nightmare scenario in the US, when does it actually become the most likely scenario? What should we be looking out for? Okay. So if we see the Fed lose their independence, okay, and whoever the political leader is begins dictating interest rates, that's a big one, okay? If interest rates are lowered by the Fed too much too quickly because of maybe not direct control, but indirect control, like we saw under Johnson and Nixon, okay, that's again, big red flag. If we begin some serious quantitative easing again, that will be a big red flag. Okay. And then if we see budget deficits and government debt continue to increase rapidly, that's a big red flag. Okay. If all of those ifs end up happening, then what we can expect to see is very, very, very high inflation, probably about 3 to 5 years out. Okay. What is very high? At least the single digits that we saw in 2021 and 2022, but probably more likely in the teens or even higher. There's no ceiling, right? There's no ceiling to the amount of inflation we could suffer because of it. Okay. All right. So the economy has been slowing, but, but lower interest rates, if done in a disciplined way, will absolutely extend the growth of our economy another 2, 3, could even be 4 years, right? More likely 2 to 3, though. Okay. So if we just allow the Fed to do their job and we see the Fed just gradually lower interest rates, not a ton, but moderately, okay, it will very likely have a very positive effect on the economy. We will still go through a recession at some point. That's a very healthy cycle to go through for the economy, but it doesn't have to be a disaster. Okay, so this is like a chart I've shown several times in the past, right? You know, when we were sitting here almost a year ago, I was saying that there was a 70% likelihood that economic growth would continue. Okay. Then, today I would put that likelihood at only about 50 to 60%. We're almost a coin flip about whether economic growth continues or we go through a recession. Okay. If the Fed loses independence, those chances just crash, right? I mean, I just made up a number, 20 to 30%. Maybe if the Fed loses independence, maybe the political parties restrain themselves and don't abuse that power. But there's like zero examples of that ever happening. So I don't know. I'm not going to bet on that. I'm not going to bet your money on that. That's for sure. Okay, so where are we right now? Okay, we are in the third year of this bull market. Okay, this bull market began in October of 2022, and so we're a little less than 3.5 years into it so far. Okay, um, as I've said before, about every 12 to 18 months, we go through a correction, right? We see the stock market drop by about 10% or so because of some external news or some new data comes out, right? And that's a normal, healthy thing. We will definitely at least have one correction this year. Okay. I can almost guarantee it. It will probably come around one of these news stories that I've been talking about, right? Developments under one of those news stories will almost certainly cause at least a correction, if not a full-on bear market. Okay. So what to expect this year? I think lots of volatility is absolutely in the cards. I don't see any way that things return to more of a political normal where we wouldn't have this type of volatility. These news developments they just have too big of an economic impact not to create volatility. Okay, but volatility goes both ways, right? Volatility goes up and volatility goes down. In that volatility, there is opportunity, right? And that's where we come into play, right? Is how do we protect you from those big drops while also taking advantage of the little drops? Okay. It's a lot easier said than done, right? We've got midterms this year. Okay, that's going to create a lot of volatility. Potential for civil unrest. Minneapolis is a mess. And I think we only see the likelihood of that type of unrest extending, hopefully not getting worse, but there seems to be just more and more the frequency, right? Of it just keeps increasing. And then, global instability that could come from imperialism, right? That is something to consider. It's very unlikely that Denmark just lets Greenland go without a fight. And if we were to see NATO dissolve over something like this, I think that would be tragic, right? I think that would likely lead to more global instability that absolutely has economic impacts. Okay. And then, what to expect in 2026, like I said, definitely a correction, if not potentially a bear market. But I kind of put it as a coin flip right now, whether it's a bear market or not. Okay, wanted to give you guys kind of an idea about what your portfolios have been doing. I kind of broke this down to look at what has happened since the bear market we went through in 2022, and then what has happened in the bull market since, including last year. Okay, so in the bear market of 2022, that was a bad bear market. That hurt. Okay, your portfolios were down between 20 and 23% top to bottom. Okay, that was like the worst bear market for a balanced stock bond portfolio in like the last 30 years because of that interest rates going so far up so fast. That's what caused that exceptionally bad performance in that type of bear market. A normal bear market, we would only expect to see maybe a 12, 14, maybe 15% drop in the portfolio. So that bear market was particularly bad for the portfolio. But then, of course, the bull market so far has been wonderful, right? In our accumulator portfolio, those are kind of our more aggressive portfolio. You guys are up 124% since the beginning of the bull market in October of 2022. Kind of our retiree portfolio, which we call growth and income, is up about 86%. And then our most conservative portfolio up 70% total. This is total cumulative growth in this bull market so far. Last year's returns were excellent, everywhere from about 14% to 19% just last year. So projecting forward, in that coin flip scenario, right, we're trying to hit about an 8% or so target return. And the trick is going to be, holding that average return, even if the nightmare scenario, ends up occurring. Okay. So what strategies do we have to look at to protect you guys from that nightmare type scenario? Okay. So first, these are all strategies we are going to be looking at, right? None of these are strategies we are ready to implement because this is just still too much of a developing story for us to make any concrete decisions yet. Okay, but we're looking at Treasury inflation protected securities. Tips, when we kind of go back and look at how they did in 2022, they did awful because interest rates went up so high, it offset all of the inflation protection that they were supposed to provide during that inflationary environment. And tips didn't exist back in the 70s in the last period of hyperinflation. They're a relatively new invention. They didn't come until the 80s. We are looking at structured notes. Again, structured notes have kind of always been our go-to way of protecting your portfolio from crises or structural problems that we were worried about in the market. Increasing your commodities allocation, great way to insulate you guys from inflation. Direct private real estate investment is another option. Real estate tends to be very sensitive to inflation, so that can be a good way of protecting the portfolio. And then finally, an increased international bond allocation. So more to come on all of these strategies that we're looking at. Goals, really, we're trying to maintain an inflation adjusted portfolio return. It does us no good to deliver portfolio returns of 15 or 20% if inflation is 15 or 20%. You're basically just treading water, right? So we're trying to deliver inflation adjusted returns for you guys that keep your standard of living up with inflation. Okay. Hedge against any drop in the US dollar. The nice part about the drop in the US dollar is we all earn US dollars and we all spend US dollars. So a drop in the US dollar doesn't impact us like fully, but we are a net importer of goods. And most of us do buy most of the stuff we use from overseas. And so our the cost of living will go up if the US dollar drops. Okay. So how can we insulate you guys against that also? Creating portfolio return stability, right? We don't want portfolio returns all over the map. We're trying to create as stable returns as possible. And then finally, along with that, stable cash flow that you guys can rely on, especially in your retirement years. Okay, so thoughts and predictions. At this point, I'm kind of saying it's maybe a coin toss or maybe slightly a little better than a coin toss that the bull market continues. The thing is, though, we can have an economic slowdown with high inflation and still have positive stock returns. It's kind of a weird situation, but that is not outside of the realm of normal. Stocks are one of the best ways to protect against high inflation. So anyway, more to come on that. The Fed is likely to continue lowering rates, assuming they maintain their independence over the next 18 months. Long-term rates, including mortgage rates, I don't think those are going to drop. That's a whole kind of another conversation. But one of the results that would come of this huge economic instability would be loss of faith in our long-term bonds, and that would actually send interest rates going up, kind of the opposite of what everyone's trying to accomplish. And then again, I do expect inflation to tick up this year. All right, I will now go ahead and stop the presentation, but open it up to any questions.